As we gather, we acknowledge the Gadigal clan of the Eora, the first inhabitants of this place from a time beyond remembering. We honour them and their elders past and present for their custodianship of the land on which we gather today. The painting you see on the screen is one of the Stations of the Cross series painted by Richard Campbell, a Gumbanga and Dunghutti man. He's a senior member of the Kinchela Boys Home Aboriginal Corporation, which seeks to tell the truth about the stolen generations. So as we gather on this day of remembering the crucifixion of love in the world, we remember the sufferings of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and pray for the strength of the cross and resurrection to lead us forward. Today we enter again into the old stories of deaths and renewals, of betrayal, injustice, and violence against the gentler powers of truth, justice, and love. That is what our narrative, which we follow from John's Gospel today, the Passion narrative of Christ, links us to and deepens our understanding. For we proclaim with Jesus that despite appearances, truth, justice, and love in the grace of God are the powers that ultimately triumph. So as we gather again this Good Friday at the foot of the cross, we bring our own sorrowful stories and those of the wider world to mingle with the story of Jesus and Jesus' companions and entrust them all to the God of love. In God's love, we seek to become people of love. We fail, of course, for to be human is to fail. But above all, on Good Friday, we affirm that failure is not what matters most. So however you come today with a heaviness of heart or uplifted by unexpected joy, in pain of body or spirit, or with a spring in your step, in whatever way you come as you are, and know that there is space for you here. On this day, we gather to remember the suffering of Christ and those who, like Christ, have suffered, often needlessly, seemingly pointlessly. And in this place, we reflect upon sufferings in our own person, in our relationships and wider community, in our nation, in our world, and in our earth. So we now light the Christ candle and 5 candles to bring to mind areas where pain is often experienced. As we reflect deeply on each one, its candle will be extinguished.
Suffering God, we worship you. O crucified Christ, child of God, born of Mary, eternal Word of God, suffering God, we worship you. O crucified Christ, holy temple of God, dwelling place of the Most High, gate of heaven, burning flame of love, suffering God, we worship you. O crucified Christ, sanctuary of justice and love, full of kindness, source of faithfulness, suffering God, we worship you. O crucified Christ, guide of every heart, in you are all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. In you dwells all the fullness of the Godhead. Suffering God, we worship you.
What kind of crucifixion do we share in on this Good Friday? Is the cross a threat, a judgment, or even a weapon? Sometimes people, when we hear Christians even talking about these things, that's the way it comes across. Is it, on the other hand, simply a sight and symbol of death and destruction? Or is it a pathway of transformation, a costly one for us and for our world? To help us enter into it as a pathway of living and loving transformation, not as a threat or as a judgment or as merely just another death in our world, I want to offer a few words around 4 images of crucifixion which may support us in our spiritual journey today. Each of them is an image from the suffering of the last century of our modern world, maybe the worst century in human history for the pain and suffering and destruction that human beings are capable of. Each of these paintings, in my view, in different ways, represents the crucifixion afresh but alive for the modern world, and encourages us, therefore, to know transformation, even out of deep suffering. But first, in introduction, let me share this great image of the crucifixion from Matthias Grunewald, which is painted for the Eisenheim altarpiece in the hospital chapel of St. Anthony's Monastery in the 15th century. What, I wonder, do you see in it? It is worth taking it and the other images I share today away with you, or today or in the future, and reflecting perhaps upon it. This painting has been deeply influential for later artists' portrayals of the cross, including the first 3 of which I will share this morning. It illustrates a significant late medieval shift born of the advance of Renaissance humanism towards exploring Christ's humanity, moving in a sense away from metaphysical pictures and philosophy to the down-to-earth struggles of human beings. Alas, that was a little bit lost at the Reformation, both in its Catholic and especially its Protestant forms, because in many churches today, even in churches, you will only see a bare cross. The human figure has been removed. And even in Catholic churches, where you will see human figures, the cross can easily become a mere symbol pointing in an abstract manner to God's metaphysical work. But this image we see here is grounded in life and the existential sufferings and challengings of the monastery of St. Anthony, which was noted for the care of plague sufferers and skin diseases, people who were socially outcast as well as suffering horrendously. And so we see in this picture human anguish and the crucified Christ pitted with plague-like sores, showing that God in Christ fully shares in such afflictions. God has not, as it were, leapt off the cross and we go straight into resurrection, nor has God, as it were, this is just a symbol of something that's happening up in heaven. So not for nothing did the great 20th century theologian Karl Barth keep a reproduction of this image in his study to remind us that his role was to point to Christ crucified, and in that sense, This image and what it shares for us is at the heart of our prayers this morning. Loving God to accompany one another through their suffering to their death takes loving courage. It feels powerless. We struggle. We can feel useless and helpless. Help us to recognize that the gift of holy presence is beyond price to the one we love. Today, in memory and imagination, we accompany Jesus on their final journey, and with Jesus, all who suffer in their own communities and in the wider world.
A reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verses 28 to 38. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out after them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Well, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The people gathered replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So, you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?"
What is truth? Pilate's words in our first reading today echo down the centuries, and artists have always been involved in exploring that question. Indeed, maybe art, more than some other so-called straightforward ways of exploring the world, enables us to go more deeply into that question. So although Pablo Picasso, for example, was an atheist, his work employed many spiritual themes. And this work represents part of his lifelong wrestling with the crucifixion, which also resonates in his great mural Guernica, in which Picasso similarly conveyed universal suffering, in that case through a single horse's head. And in a sense, the Christ figure and the cross represents that universal suffering in a similar manner. Because, as insightful critics have observed, Picasso, in his best works, was seeking to express the presence of transcendence, of something more than we immediately see in the here and now, seeking, as Charles Pixton put it, some other realm of feeling and thought to handle suffering. Because suffering, Picasso, with religious folk and others, affirms that suffering is not the end. So here Picasso helps us wrestle with what truthful meaning we can find in life with so much death afflicting us. Not for easy answers, but for us to be conveyed into something deeper. 3 experiences are reflected in Picasso's crucifixion for his own journey. Firstly, the death of Picasso's younger sister Conchita from diphtheria when he was 14, a death he carried with him throughout his life. Secondly, his close contact with war and its destructions, even before the Spanish Civil War, and not least the effects of defeat, including the plight of refugees. So, if you like, read Gaza and other places into that picture. And thirdly, especially, the suicide of his friend Carlos Casamegas in 1901. What suffering, I wonder, do we ourselves bring to this time that we too paint, as it were, into this picture? Picasso's crucifixion vividly portrays the raw anguish and desperation of human emotion arising from our intense experiences of death. So Picasso drew on ancient Spanish faith and culture, not least the Christian story, but he shifted from the Christ figure alone to human agony more widely, with crucifixions of all kinds named as both violent, unspeakable crimes, and yet also places for the renewal of life if we can enter into them with penitence and with a rediscovery of what truly matters. So we see the sharp black and white of the crucified figure amid the colours of life. The colours of life which can be distracting and superficial, and then we're hit by the black and white. And yet the black and white is also connected to those colours of life because it is not the end but a way of re-entering into those colours. Picasso uses other images in this painting, including those of the bullfight out of his Spanish tradition. So you can see the centurion there on a little horse like a picador with a spear, which he has transposed, encouraging us to reflect on how our cultures both inflict pain on others and also have the potential to transform it. So Picasso's crucifixion figuratively links the passion of Christ to other spiritual pathways which wrestle with the question of truth and the mystery of life in death. Our story of Christ is not standing alone in dealing with this, but it offers us a pathway to, really, Picasso is saying, into linking those other stories together. So note the figure of Christ with paddle-like hands, which are very similar to Cycladic and North African divine imagery, as well as surrealism. To the left and right of Christ are figures which probably represent the moon, the sun, and maybe the Virgin Mary. Art historians also suggest that the figure to the right is likely a reference to cultic Mithraic imagery, which was around at the time of Christ and is part of other cultures. On the far left and right are the small tall crosses of the two thieves. And in the right foreground are soldiers gambling for Christ's garment. And critically, in the left corner, in the left foreground, are two crumpled figures which both represent the two thieves and the revivification of Adam and Eve, representatives of humanity at the foot of the cross. So what Picasso is saying is that black and white is real in our lives, but colours are still there and can be renewed when we enter truly into the meaning of suffering. That new life can rise for humanity even in the midst of death.
A reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 1 to 16. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and striking him on the face. Pilate went out again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the crowd saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The crowd answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God." Now when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You will have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the crowd cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the people, "Here is your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The leaders answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified.
We have no king but the emperor. Our second reading challenges us to reflect on what provides true power and what is the underlying order for our lives and world beyond the claims of the Pilates and the other emperors of our world. And we see plenty of them today, and some of them are around us here in the claims of economy and other ways in which our world impacts upon people who are marginalized. For the narrative of this gospel relates how the Romans, symbolizing the power of empire, ridiculed both Jesus and the Judean people, the people of the Holy Land, whose land and faith and culture were swept away by empire and under existential threat. So where do we find hope in the face of such destructive forces that can sweep away all our nation, all our world, and maybe even smash parts of the universe or the universes to bits? Dali, Salvador Dali's crucifixion, Corpus Hypercubus, is one response, born out of such modern fears, particularly in Dali's case, in the face of nuclear destruction after the Second World War. Today, such fears we can see in the fears for the stability of the global order, war, nuclear destruction, and today, climate change, each of which similarly mocks our hopes and dreams, because that is what the empires do to us and what the empires do to everything. Ultimately, they destroy. So in the face of such perils and manifest crucifixions of life itself, not just on a personal level, but on a corporate and indeed planetary level, where can we find faith? Dali's painting returns to the cross, to see in it not only suffering, but ultimate assurance through divine transcendence. Now, of course, Salvador Dali's imagery reflects his own idiosyncratic style and emphases. In particular, Dali's crucifixion uses his theory of nuclear mysticism, which fused together Catholicism, mathematics, and science, because Dali was clear that true faith and religion and science do not conflict, but need to work together if this world is to have a future. And consequently, we see here Christ on a polyhedron net of a tesseract, or a hypercube, alongside some dreamlike, surrealist features, such as the vast barren landscape and giant chessboard. So like John's Gospel, Dali was keen to encourage us to transcend the immediacy of our lives and go deeper into reality. So just as God, in God's self, exists in a place incomprehensible to human beings, the hypercube exists in 4 spatial dimensions, equally, ultimately inaccessible to the mind. And so what Dali is saying is that this is the underlying truth of love behind the world, whatever we currently see or experience. Christ, however, provides us a human form of God, an immediate form of God that is more relatable, because Christ shows us God among us, but also points us to this deeper ultimate reality of love. For note that the representation of Christ here is transcendent. It is a surrealistic, levitating figure with a body that is healthy, athletic, and without signs of torture. In a sense, it points us to the ultimate and to resurrection. Because without denying the suffering of which Picasso's crucifixion and indeed Grunewald's crucifixion and the gospel speak, Dali, like John's Gospel, and John's Gospel offers us this particular line, I think, beyond the others, points us as to why this Friday is Good Friday, because it does not only speak and allow us to reflect on suffering and pain, but reveals the ultimate force of love, which can never be crushed despite outer appearances, for God is there and beyond. And for our human part, note in the bottom left of the painting, Mary Magdalene. She appears in crucifixion portrayals like this very often, and in that place, on the painting's edge. In this case, this is Dali's wife, actually, Gala, or was the model for it, who witnesses Christ's spiritual triumph over corporeal harm. So at the edge, as it were, between the earthly and the transcendent. That's where the cross is, and that's where we live, I think, between the earthly and the transcendent. She represents our humanity, which is called to bear suffering, but in the vision of ultimate love and truth, grace and glory, which is uncrushable, even by the worst that earthly powers can do to us.
A reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 16b to 24. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the people read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Then the chief priest said to Pilate, "Do not write, 'the King of the Jews,' but write, 'This man said, I am the King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says, "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothes they cast lots." And that is what the soldiers did.
Where do we see crucifixion today? In John's Gospel, in their colonial occupation of the Holy Land, the Romans clearly targeted Jesus' people, the people of the land, named here by John as the Jews, though more accurately perhaps Judeans in Jesus' day, for Judaism is a complex and extraordinary movement of faith in which Christianity is also bound up, and its present forms take from the fall of the temple after Jesus' death. For John's Gospel's use of the Jews strongly puts us into struggles around oppression and anti-Semitism that are risen again in different ways today. For it raises up for us questions of historic scapegoating, of racism and oppression. This is at the heart of F.N. Souza's reflection upon Christ's Passion, which was produced in 1959 produced in Britain at a time of great racial resistance to people coming from the Commonwealth. Even though the British had established an empire, they resisted and still resist people that they have a responsibility to, whose land and possessions they have taken. It was produced in 1959 and it is entitled Crucifixion, because Sousa was an Indian who mainly worked in Britain but was born in Goa, which was dominated in his youth by Roman Catholicism. And as a result, Sousa was deeply anti-clerical. But like both Picasso and Dali, his work reflects the power that Christ's passion and archetypal religious images still have in the modern world, even when they are denied. And the problem of secularism is that they leave those images to the right and to other people who can destroy, instead of renewing them as Picasso and Sousa did. When they are released from their over-predictable ecclesiastical captivity, these images, not least the Passion of Christ, speaks afresh. And that is what Sousa is saying. Sousa's crucifixion reminds us powerfully, firstly, of the offensiveness of Christ, the offensiveness of the cross. It is offensive to people. It is not something you want to look at. Let's create Easter bonnets and rabbits understandably for children, like my grandchildren have been wearing, but let's not look deeply and tell the truth of human existence and power and oppression and theft of this land and other places. For Christ is offensive to normal or polite society and to society that just wants to repeat what we already have, despite its injustices. But Sousa's cross also points us vitally to the liberating strength of that divine offensiveness. This is not just a victim, this is strength of liberation. For Sousa himself had been expelled from colonial art circles in India because some of his paintings were regarded as obscene. And later, whilst he was initially regarded as something new on the scene because he's a coloured person, his prolific art receded in acceptability because what he spoke about challenged entrenched racism. Because central to Sousa's work, as we see here, are representations of other than white suffering male bodies. That is deeply offensive still to people today. So no wonder that Sousa's crucifixion asks us to see the crucified Christ again, especially people like me who've been brought up in that white post-imperial world. No longer to see Christ as just one of the blonde operatic Christs of the churches of Sousa's childhood or many of our own, and to see Sousa offering us a different image of masculinity, one that is incredibly powerful and strong, and yet bears with it vulnerability, empathy, and connection with land and people. It challenges us to think afresh about the cross and issues of racism, decolonization, and masculinity in our own day, reminding us of how, as on Golgotha long ago, God is in the very midst of the horrors and hopes they bear, and those who are struggling with that are part of the suffering, liberating Christ. Now, Sousa's Christ was of particular historical significance, as I say, as a black Christ. It was very unusual to picture Christ as black, exhibiting particularly not just victimhood, but extraordinary enduring strength in the face of violence. But note well also in Sousa's portrayal how the figure of Christ becomes a tree of crucifixion. This is partly to exhibit the strength, but also it's the connection between this vision of masculine humanity with the earth itself. Not separate, like some masculine forms of politics and religion are from the earth itself, but grounded deeply in it. With its thorny branches come arms extending across the image, and its feet, which are like roots, set as firm supports for all that the tortured figure takes on physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So what Susa is saying to us, to the hard-pressed peoples of our world, not including those suffering at the moment in Gaza, to all the oppressed, he's saying, however they treat you now and divide your possessions, like the story of Jesus in John's Gospel, God is at the heart of this and is at the heart of your strength and your eventual salvation. Take courage, even in the midst of your sufferings, for they cannot destroy, and your suffering is part of your liberation.
A reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 25 to 30. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then Jesus bowed his head and gave up his spirit.
John's Gospel does not provide us with Jesus' dialogue with the thieves crucified with him and the reconciliation that one of them finds in that. But I think we do well to hold that story alongside the one we've heard, because John gives us something very similar. He gives us those words from Jesus to his mother and the words of Jesus to the beloved disciple. These center on new relationship, for this suffering and this death is not an end, but Jesus' life has been completed and he has left behind, and he encourages us to find new community, which is based on reconciliation. So it complements that encounter of Jesus with those labeled with Jesus as criminals and outcasts in society. Because as we saw with Picasso's crucifixion, the cross challenges us to know the truth of life in death. As with Dali's crucifixion, Corpus Hypercubus, it invites us to reflect more deeply about ultimate meaning. And as we saw with Susa's crucifixion, it calls on us to acknowledge continuing pain and the liberating strength that is found in struggles, for example, against racism, colonization, and oppression today. But it also asks us to renew community, beginning with ourselves, by acknowledging those things for which we are responsible, for our limitations, and to reconnect with others for a better world. And this is the gift of our final picture, which is not so much great art like those earlier images, but is art in which we ourselves are called to share. And indeed, it is an encouragement for us to paint or write or dance or whatever else we do, our own stories of redeeming love out of this day. Because this is one panel from the Stations of the Cross, painted a few years ago by men in Tennessee, prisoners, criminals, on death row. It calls us, like Jesus on the cross, even at our limits, when nothing else seems possible, when the end is among us and upon us, when we are on death row, and in a sense we're all on death row, to reach out and enable fresh community. So as we reflect on this and the meaning of the cross, we are invited to make our own response in the same way as the men on death row did not just be consumed by their own pain and suffering, but look for ways in which even in their deaths they could let go of things that were painful and hurtful that they had done to others and create something new. I conclude, therefore, with a quote from one of the men involved. This piece of art is a commentary on the continuing battle for our collective moral and spiritual worldview. It is a collaborative effort with several of my fellow artists, all of whom reside on Tennessee's death row. Now, not all are Christians or even religious. Several chose to be anonymous. I asked my fellow community members to help create this project to begin a conversation about what justice looks like. Isn't that a wonderful thing we could do? What does justice and community that is healthy look like? That is the gift of these people on death row, the criminals on the cross. For when Jesus was executed, justice looked different from what it does today. But justice today has some of the same components as it did back then. The guilty and the innocent are subjected to state-sanctioned processes. As I understand it, state-sanctioned, obviously in the USA, means that we, the people, collectively speaking, uphold this system of justice. So what is done to the crucified is part of our responsibility, even if we are not being crucified. So based upon our support, this system of justice reflects our community's sense of morals and values. One of the biggest issues, my sense, says the writer, of the Christian world, one of the problems it has is dealing with the fact that Jesus was not Caucasian and was not powerful. And this is true here on death row, a microcosm of the larger free world community. So we decided not to limit one another's understanding of Jesus' death or appearance. I do not know how many opinions we changed during this project, but the dialogue was open and honest beyond what I'd imagined. Safe, open dialogue is a prerequisite for the community model created out of this reflection on the crucifixion on death row. So we invite dialogue from anyone on how to change the paradigms of our collective lives with those that promote healing and reconciliation within our diverse communities. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? That is what we are here today and what we continue to do in the future in this place and with all who join us, Muslim Collective, Hindus for Human Rights, whoever else it is around us, that we are here inspired by the cross of Christ to change the paradigms of our collective lives with those that also promote healing and reconciliation within our diverse communities. The letter concludes, in the spirit of love, mercy, and forgiveness, Derek Quintero. May that spirit of the cross of Jesus guide and strengthen us today and in the days ahead. Amen.